Today, I'm speaking with Peter Mandeno, or should I say Dr. Peter Mandeno, because he just finished a Ph.D. on designing human connectivity. He has a lot of experience in the meetings and event industry and obviously now in academia. It's a fascinating conversation. Enjoy this episode with Peter Mandeno. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Business of Meeting podcast. And today I had the great pleasure with speaking with Peter Mandeno. Fascinating career in our industry, but also he had just finished last year a PhD working on designing human connectivity, which is absolutely fascinating. We're going to speak about all of that. Peter, thank you very much for being with me today.
Eric, it's an absolute pleasure.
So first and foremost, you have you're a citizen of the world. You're from New Zealand. You've worked and lived in many different countries. You're now in the UK. Tell us a little bit about what is your story and how did you get into our industry?
Sure. Well, it's a very long story, and I'll try and condense it and give you some highlights. So, as you mentioned, I grew up in New Zealand, beautiful country down at the bottom of the earth, and I went through university not really knowing exactly what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I completed a couple of undergraduate degrees, one in business and the other in science with a psychology major. And then, like a lot of young New Zealanders, I wanted to get out. We have this two-letter acronym, which is the OE, which is our overseas experience. And I think there's a tendency, maybe because we're so isolated, to want to kind of explore and see more of what the world has to offer. And so I got an opportunity to work at a company in Minneapolis, which is a city that I must admit I had never heard of. So it was an internship at a marketing travel company. So that was my ticket out. And from there, it was no turning back. So from there, I went on to my boss actually in Minneapolis was Danish. Through him, I got made introductions in Denmark. So I moved from Minneapolis to Copenhagen, had a fantastic time, fell in love with Copenhagen and the Danish culture and design and everything about Denmark. But at that point, I was looking for something different. I'd worked a couple of years by now in the travel industry. Some friends were traveling overland through the Middle East, and I agreed to join them. So we flew down to Turkey, and then I spent the next 3 months traveling over Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt on a trip I guess you'd never even think of doing now, or it would be very, very different. So I was incredibly fortunate to have had that opportunity. Then I traveled around Europe for 3 months, and in the course of doing that, I met a few people who were working in the what I guess you could call graphic design or communication design industry, and they helped me with a few introductions. And so I arrived in London, and within a couple of weeks, I was doing presentation graphics at a big bank in London. So that got me into the kind of creative agency world. So I worked for that bank for a year, and then moved on to work with a company that was supplying very high-end graphics and technology systems to what at that time was the global financial roadshow circuit. So I was working for this company, traveling around the world, helping senior executives look fantastic on screen as they sold off big chunks of their companies. And that was a fantastic kind of rock and roll whirlwind. It was all private jets and limousines. And, we were going around all the big cities in the world in very short periods of time. And it got me fascinated with this kind of communication design, storytelling, graphic design. And I went out to Amsterdam to set up the Dutch office for this company, which is really where I got more into events and dug really deep into the world of events. So because Amsterdam doesn't have quite the financial, or isn't quite the financial hub that London is, I was expanding and applying the same kind of services to other types of what I describe as live communication. So huge corporate events, fashion shows, that type of thing. And that was kind of where my entry point into the world of events was made. And so I spent a lot of time working mostly backstage at huge events, kind of in the inner workings, if you like, of what makes them tick. So you've got your audience out there enjoying the experience, and there's a huge amount going on backstage that most people just don't have exposure to. So I did that for several years in Amsterdam. In the end, I stayed in Amsterdam for a total of eight and a half years. The final year was much more in the entertainment industry. So working with a large organization there that was focused on everything from TV production to artist management and so on. And I'd had, by this stage, I guess about a decade in the creative industry, the creative events space. And I wanted to two things. Number one, because I'd kind of fallen accidentally into this world, I wanted to see again what else was out there. I've always been incredibly curious. And secondly, I didn't think I'd given the United States a good chance. I'd realized, having become a bit more worldly and having met many more people, that I probably should have been on either coast, so either East Coast or West Coast. So I went out to New York looking for my next adventure, so to speak. And in the course of discovering or searching for that adventure, I started a concept in New York called Walk and Wine. So walk as in the thing you cook in, not slow running, walking.
Slow eating.
Slow. Well, yeah, it was actually quite fast eating, but my accent, a lot of people think I say walk. Yeah, anyway, Walk and Wine. And Walk and Wine was really I provided a really valuable pivot, and is what led me into my current path, which is human connectivity. So I was interested in making new connections, as I mentioned, but I had a couple of observations. First was that the world, it seemed, was crying out for the bringing together of diverse minds to solve some of the increasingly challenging problems or address some of the big challenges we're facing, these wicked problems. But at the same time, it seemed that people weren't, what was being preached was not being practiced. So people were still, fashion people were going to fashion events, and finance people were going to finance events, and so on. And I was really interested in having different kinds of conversations. And, the world tries really hard to shove us back into the bucket or the box that it saw that we came out of. So, people would find out I was from New Zealand, and they'd be introducing me to other New Zealanders, or they knew I had a creative or an events past, and so they introduced me to other people in that space. But I was looking for my next venture, and what Walk and Wine did was, as we came to describe it, it helped you to find the people you didn't know you were looking for. So we kind of inadvertently had created what turned out to be the perfect conditions for serendipitous encounters. So I took this concept around the world a few times, and in about a 3-year period, we did something like 150 or more than 150 events in 12 countries. Wow. And connected thousands of people in the process. And I became fascinated with the effectiveness of this concept, the universal effectiveness. Everywhere we took it, it was doing something magical, and it was connecting people in ways that they hadn't been connected before, very efficiently and very effectively. And so I guess my curiosity perked up again, and I was really looking to understand what it was about the concept that made it work so well. So not exactly the pieces of this particular puzzle, but if we decontextualize them and thought about how might those same kind of principles be applied in other places. And that led with, or coincided with, a move back to London and a chance encounter with an academic at the Imperial College in London. And we started looking for ways to collaborate. And in the end, as you mentioned, I convinced myself that doing a Ph.D. and sitting with these questions for 5 years would be a great idea. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years.
That's fascinating. And I need to interrupt you there, because you make it sound so easy. Yeah, I was in Amsterdam, and I thought I'm going to go and give a shot in New York. Yeah, and I have this concept, and I did in so many different countries. Let's go back there a little bit. When you decide to come to New York, do you know someone? Do you have some contacts, or you just arriving at JFK and say, okay, let's see what I can do here?
Yeah, absolutely. I get what you mean. And it is, I think so. After you've done it a few times, it seems to come quite easily or naturally, but it's never easy moving from one country to the next. It's a lot easier when you're single, I think. Now I have kids, and that just adds to the complication. But yes, I had contacts in the US, some contacts, and that made it easier. I think the other thing was I already had quite a good track record in the kind of creative agency world, the events world. Having delivered some gigantic projects, I was better able to kind of create a case for getting a visa for myself. And so that was, I wasn't being sponsored by an organization that was bringing me into the US. I had to really put together a strong case to enable myself to get a visa. And that, for me, having lived in all these places, the kind of the paperwork involved in moving from place to place is one of the most debilitating, frustration-inducing things that you can imagine.
I agree.
Yeah, it's surprising that how countries, of course, don't share data. That's important, and I understand that. But every time you go through exactly the same process, it's a 20, 30, 40 page documents answering all the same questions that you answered 2, 3, 4 years ago. Yeah, so that was New York, but it was the same everywhere, and I think when I think back to it, a common thread was connections. It was always about connections, of knowing, leaving New Zealand in the first place. That was through a good, strong connection I had with one of my professors who happened to know someone at the company that I ended up going to work for. As I mentioned, my boss in Minneapolis was Danish, and he made introductions to people in Denmark. It was the friends I met traveling around Europe who introduced me to the creative agency world when I got to London, and so on and so on. So I think we often forget about that. We forget about the role that people, that connections play in granting us access to the things that really, allow us to prosper in our lives. And so often we're moving through life so quickly, and we're always looking ahead, and we don't spend enough time, I think, reflecting on the importance of connections. And often they're the most unlikely people who happen to open a door, or just when you need it, make exactly the connection that you're looking for.
Absolutely. And I have so many cases myself of serendipity. I strongly believe in that. And so, but I love the way you define serendipity is looking for the people that you didn't know you need. What is exactly the sentence you use?
Yeah, helping you find the people you didn't know you were looking for.
Helping you find the people you didn't know you were looking for. I love it. And before we speak about your PhD and also the decision to actually go back to academia to do that, how did you manage your concept of walk and wine? How do you manage to have it in so many different countries? And was it like a definitive action you wanted to take in a project, or just, again, serendipity, some people telling you, oh, I like that, I like to do this in my city? How did that work to do it in so many different countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest, it provided me with a fantastic lesson, because I'm someone who I'm quite a perfectionist. I always go above and beyond, and often, that leads me to doing things that I didn't necessarily need to do to get a project over the line. If I'd thought right at the beginning, I'm going to create this thing that's going to go to all these countries and so on, I think I would have been overwhelmed with all of the decisions, and I would have fallen into the trap of overthinking. So when it started, it was actually with my girlfriend at the time in New York, and she was very well connected in New York, and I not so much. And in the beginning, it was really just creating small event. The first event, I think, was 12 people, and then it went up to those people all knew someone else, and they knew someone else, and so on. And the intention was never that it become a business. At its core, it was just asking the question: what happens if you bring a bunch of diverse, curious, open-minded people together? And as it turns out, number one, magic happens when you do that. And number two, there are a lot of open-minded, curious, diverse people in the world who are looking to make these new kinds of connections. And so it very much became a case of the expression, the cart leading the horse. So, the first event was fairly a haphazard kind of hack together of many things. And then everyone had a great time, and someone says, oh, we should do this again. And so then there was another event, and that was slightly bigger. And then and then it became a thing. And I come from this world of storytelling and branding, and I like to wrap things up in a concept and a narrative. So of course it had to have a name, and it had to have a story, and so I became very conscious of that. And so that's where Wok and Wine was born. And the concept, the wok is a gigantic 24-inch or 60-centimeter wok that we're cooking jumbo prawns or gambas in, and the wine being wine that you drink. And so those were the two kind of key components. And then there was this process of, number one, back to your question of how did we grow. I was still traveling at the time. I'd lived in all these places, and revisiting those places, and inevitably the question would come up of, so what are you doing these days? And my answer was, well, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm doing these days. But in the meantime, I've been running these events. And then, someone would say, well, we can get a wok. And I know someone who's got, a seafood dealer or whatever. And so you sort of cobble all the pieces together. And then before you knew it, you had an event, and you had all the components of that. As we got more traction, we had really interesting things happening where someone who had been to an event in one part of the world was telling their friends in another part of the world when they knew that we were going to be there. And so either you had people who happened to be, they may have been to an event in Sydney and happened to be in New York at the time we were doing an event there, and so joined us. Or we had this situation, for example, when we did an event in London, a woman who had been to one of our events in Sydney had known we were coming to London. She had bought 2 tickets online because everything was online by this stage, emailed her friend saying, don't ask me what this is, just go and you're going to have a great time. And so we had this kind of really interesting, unexpected guests showing up, and it got to the point, there was a real kind of, transition moment where it went from feeling like we knew many of the people in the room to having absolutely no idea who pretty much anyone was. And that was incredibly nerve-wracking, because you're essentially inviting or letting a bunch of strangers into what were generally quite private spaces, having no idea who they were. But what I realized is, like, when you kind of push through that nervousness, that anxiety, the more diverse, the more the participants were strangers to each other, the more magical the experience every single time. And whenever we did events that we purposely tried to kind of curate the audience or curate the crowd, they tended to be, they were still great, but they just didn't have that same magic and the same sense of kind of unpredictability in the most wonderful sense of the word.
That's interesting. I'm a member of a community called MMT, which is extremely curated. And that's one of the things that I like, because you have a higher percentage of chances, at least that's how I look at it, to find great people, great human beings. But I love what you're saying as well. At the other side of the spectrum, if you want to have a total serendipity. Now, when you were talking, remind me of the book, The Medici Effect, where the Renaissance, where they brought people from totally different field and tried to find new ideas and new concepts. In what you did with this Wok and Wine, and bringing people so different from so diverse background, do you remember anything that came out of it? Any outcome, any stories that actually happened because of that situation?
There are so many stories. I think we would need an entire podcast series to go through all of them. We know of people who have got married, having met at Wok and Wine. I have many, many fantastic friends who, friendships that were established during Wok and Wine. Companies were started, through people who joined. I would say, so there's that kind of, when we think about box ticking and, tangible, practical outcomes, I think some of the more wonderful outcomes were much more, I was going to say anecdotal, but it's not anecdotal in the sense that it's made up, but it was just things that were happening at these events. So there's one event that really springs to mind was the one we did in Sydney in Australia, where, and excuse all the tangents, but that's just how I think and how my brain works.
Please.
So
Please.
One thing that we noticed was the social differences between the countries that we went to. So in New York, for example, it's quite okay to show up to an event by yourself. People often went in pairs, but it's quite okay just to go by yourself. In London, and I'd say more broadly in Commonwealth countries and also parts of Europe, people tend to show up in pairs. So it's very seldom that, as lone individuals show up, and also that you don't get big groups. In Australia, they hunt in social packs, and so you'd get like really, big groups, 6, 8, 10 people all kind of getting tickets together. So that was just a really interesting insight into kind of how people operate socially. But this one situation that really springs to mind was a group of young professionals who had come. They were all dressed in attire that said they'd come straight from the city. So they're in suits and so on. And it was a group of 6 or 7. And the first, let's say it was the group of 7. The first 6 came in and they were super confident. They were on a mission, and they, held themselves really high and so on. And they came in. They had total kind of social control, and they knew exactly kind of how they were operating. The final guy came in, and he looked so uncomfortable. I mean, this event was in this crazy artist's loft kind of space. There were these crazy sculptures all around the place. It was super funky, and he clearly had no idea how to operate in this setting. And he was, I don't know where he'd come from, but it was in Sydney, in Australia in the summer. He was sweating a bit. He just looked very uncomfortable. And, I met him at the beginning, and I remember talking to him and him saying, my friends dragged me along, like they just bought an extra ticket. And how does this work? And you could sense the anxiety in his voice. At every walk and wine event, there were 3 phases. There's before the walk, during the walk, and after the walk. So before the walk, everyone has a glass of wine and they're sort of standing around. It's the typical kind of network setting. During the walk is when we put the prawns out on the table and people are standing around eating with their hands. It's incredibly intimate and almost primitive in a way, like it's very hands-on. And then you have the after the walk, where this transformation has taken place, and the types of conversations and the groupings of people are this is where the real magic happens. And I remember seeing this guy who had been so uncomfortable at the beginning, surrounded by a group of people, absolutely killing it. He just had, he had everyone, hanging on every word. And he came up to me afterwards and said, this was the best experience of my life. I was so nervous when I came in. And it was that thing of creating the space, and maybe we'll get onto this towards the end of the conversation, but it's like creating the space for that magic to happen. And so there were so many of these moments where we had people who, I guess, would describe themselves as socially awkward or uncomfortable in these kind of social gatherings, absolutely thriving. And, you're creating the space that they can really come into their own. I mean, there's other examples I know of. There was a girl I was speaking to, or a woman I was speaking to, had been to one of our events in New York, and we always asked for feedback. And she messaged saying, like, this was the most expensive experience of my life. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, I met this guy and we went to a bar afterwards, and I was showing off and doing yoga on the bar and fell down and took out my front teeth. And so there's quite a spectrum of stories that I could share, but but I think it was those moments of where you just take a step back and you just see this humans at their absolute ultimate kind of potential, connecting as humans, a lot of the anxiety and the nervousness and whatever taken away, the apprehension about connecting to others. And you'll have a school teacher and an architect and a venture capitalist having a conversation about their last trip to Italy or something like. And it's these kind of magical conversations. I just also wanted to touch on your point about curated versus uncurated crowds. And what we came to realize with Walk and Wine was that the concept was kind of curating itself. And what I mean by that is, the events were in these strange places, like not typical food and wine or kind of event type spaces, but we would go to abandoned buildings and like the artist studio that I mentioned, on a beach, in a basement, what have you. And so there's like a strange space. All you know for sure is that you're going to be in a room with 40 to 50 strangers peeling jumbo prawns from a table with your hands. Like that's the only kind of guarantee I can give you. And what we found is that if you're willing to show up for that, it says something quite powerful about you. It's a lot more powerful description of you as a person than something that you might write on a profile that you fill in to join a community or something. It says that I'm open, I'm curious, I'm willing to give things a go. And that, to me, we had a 99.999% success rate because people kind of they were all in. And because of that, I had this theory that interesting people, so we were for interesting and interested people. So interesting people end up doing interesting things in their lives and makes other people and other people who are interested in that, want to have those kind of conversations. And so you have this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of, the curious people end up doing really interesting things. And there's nothing other curious people like hearing about than the interesting things that they've done. And so it was kind of at that level, which is really hard to put on your LinkedIn profile or fill in, a set of tags or what have you.
That's fascinating. The way you talk about it, don't you miss it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's two things. Well, number one, yes, I absolutely miss it. It's this, and you can probably hear it in my voice and the way I'm expressing. It was incredible. It's absolutely incredible the way it transforms groups. Two things got in the way. Number one was starting a PhD, and a PhD is quite a taxing drain on your time and your mental and creative reserves. And the second was that COVID came along, and walk and wine is really the antithesis of social distancing. I mean, we literally push people beyond their comfort zone, their social comfort zone, to be, very, very much in each other's personal spaces. And so I think the world is just getting to a point now where people are a bit less apprehensive about being that close to each other. And so now that I've finished my PhD, it's possibly time to dust off the walk again and get started.
That's great. I can see a walk in your future. Now, the change maybe is that you're going to have people asking for vegan food, non-gluten or kosher or this and that. And that's going to be a different world. Are they going to say, why are you discriminating against the vegan people with the prawns? That is not fair.
We actually have encountered that very early on, because you have vegan, you have kosher. I mean, and obviously there's wine as well, and a lot of cultures don't attribute alcohol with social events. That said, we did many in the end, because we were doing these social events, and then companies started reaching out to us. Organizations would say, hey, and it was typically someone who'd been to one of our events would say, this would be the perfect thing to get my team and this other team together. And there's been a bit of animosity, or we're trying to figure out better ways of working. We did events with large organizations that were looking to repair or strengthen client relationships. We did events with big networks that were trying to bring together kind of disparate people from different fields to find new ways of collaborating and so on. And of course, once you start delivering these experiences for organizations, you need those options, because otherwise, to your point, you're excluding people. So we were serving Vietnamese summer rolls, so rice paper rolls that were equally kind of hands-on. And there, essentially, you've got a rice paper wrapping, and you can put anything in that you like. So, typically you could use tofu or halloumi, grilled halloumi, or something else that gave it that protein substance. So the biggest event actually that we ever did was 350 people, I want to say, at a huge charity event in the Netherlands. And we had 8 tables kind of going out, like, instead of a single long table, we had 8 tables going out like sunbeams from a central stage. And they were kind of interspersed, where you had prawn tables and other option tables. Although there's something about the messiness of the prawns that definitely adds to the that experience.
Now, Peter, you've traveled around the world. You have organized so many different events. You've met many, many, many different people. You've worked in small, large events. And then you're going to academia and you're doing a PhD, which, if I want to caricaturize the PhD, is that you were alone with 1,500 books for 5 years in front of your computer. How does that happen?
Yeah, great question. Great analysis as well. That's exactly what it is. How did that happen? Again, I think my curiosity got the better of me. So I had this very successful event series, this experience. Walk and Wine was never a business. It never started with a commercial intent. And to be honest, it beyond kind of wiping its own face, it didn't get much further than that. And part of that was because we wanted to keep the ticket price low enough to make it accessible to everyone, and understanding that interesting people come from all walks of life. Once we started doing corporate events, of course, there you can start playing with the pricing and so on, and start thinking in more commercial ways. But it was never so much about that, and I became much more fascinated in what it was that was happening. And I saw, we're living in a world that's increasingly polarized, and this is in society, but also within organizations. And there's this desire to bring different kinds of people together. Number one, it doesn't happen on its own, and number two, that on its own is not a source of magic. It's more often a source of friction and tension and so on. You can bring different kinds of people together, but you need to create the conditions for them to thrive, knowing that people are coming from very different perspectives and so on. And so I had all these questions about Walk and Wine. We were very fortunate in 2013 to have been featured in an article in Harvard Business Review talking about the business case for serendipity. And that, I think, for me, was the sort of final aha moment of, okay, it's not just me that sees potential here. There's people who know what they're talking about, who see something really interesting in what we're doing. And so I'd met an academic at Imperial College in London, and we were looking for a way to collaborate. I was thinking, like, could we use Walk and Wine as a case study? I wanted to understand, what was working, and jump forward, I guess, 18 months of conversations, and this opportunity came up where he called me up one day and said, how about doing a PhD? I think there's some funding available. You've got all these questions. It would allow us an opportunity to collaborate for, 5 years. So how about it? And I couldn't think of a reason not to do it. So yeah, I jumped in. I'd say, if I'm completely honest, rather naively about what it would entail. But again, I was led by my curiosity and this real quest to understand and to be able to make sense of the power of this concept that I'd seen, and kind of break it down into its component pieces, that those could then be applied in other ways. So that others, for example, even if you were designing an event or an experience that didn't have anything to do with prawns or wine, that you could still leverage the same design principles to apply them in the creation of experience that might have a similar effect. Mm-hmm. So long story, but it was my curiosity that led me down that path.
And you finished it, so congratulations. I know it's a podcast, so unfortunately we cannot talk for many hours, but still, what are some of the findings that you uncover writing your thesis that you want to apply now back to the meetings and event industry?
Yeah, sure. And absolutely, there's, I'm happy to dive into this with, as you can tell, I'm quite passionate about human connectivity, and there's a lot more that you uncover in 5 years of research and writing a 100,000 word document than you can perhaps share in a podcast. But at a high level, I think several things. Firstly, when we're talking about human connection or human connectivity, I think there's a tendency to think about it in all-encompassing terms. So, we often hear these phrases like get everyone on the same page, or get the team connected, or create a real sense of connection or connectivity within our event. And what I realize is that when you're speaking in these very sort of holistic terms, it's hard to design for that. It's hard to think about a specific thing that you're going to work on. So what I set out doing in the beginning was really breaking down the process of connecting into its component parts. And I did my PhD in the Department of Design Engineering in a kind of behavioral design research group. So it was very applied. And this is in quite stark contrast to a lot of the work that's been done that comes from social science and management, where it's much more descriptive. It's explaining the way of the world, why things are as they are, whereas design engineering is much more about saying, how can we then design for improved outcomes? So my first thing, as I was saying, is to kind of break down the process and thinking about, so if you think, for example, with an event, there are 5 phases to human connectivity. So finding, forming, maintaining, leveraging, and disconnecting. If you think about the needs of people when they are finding others to connect to, that's very different to, say, people who are looking to maintain the connections that they already have. And so your approach to those as, as a meeting designer, an event designer, an experience designer is quite different. On the one hand, you're thinking about how can I ensure that people, find other relevant connections over the course of my event, or maybe before they even arrive, or what have you. With maintaining, it's much more about thinking of the spaces in between. Often events or meetings work in series. And so you're thinking about how can I support people in maintaining the connections they already have in between those meetings or across, space and time, particularly when a lot of meetings are happening in a kind of hybrid format these days, where you've got some people in person and some people, online. So that was one thing. I really dove into the first phase of finding and identified the different tactics that you can adopt in finding those. So serendipitous is one of those, and that's kind of leaving things to chance. But one of the most undervalued, I think, finding tactics is what I call suggestions, or synonymous with introductions. So just encouraging and ideally empowering people to make introductions within a community, and doing that in a structured way, as opposed to just leaving it to happen on its own. So that was this kind of high level of, thinking about what is the process of connecting. I looked at what I saw as some of the challenges from it. If you think about the approach that we take, and what I found was that generally a lot of, either human connectivity is an afterthought. So we think first about, what's the location, who are the speakers, what's the food and beverage, if there's accommodation, where's that going to be, and so on. And the connectivity comes as an afterthought. I would encourage organizations to embed human connectivity into every aspect of the design process, to think about how can this contribute to people making the connections that they're looking to make. So kind of move it much more front and center. And through the work that I've done is the shift from what I describe as intuitive to informed approaches. So instead of intuitive being, this is what I've done before, this is what seems to work for me, this is what the competitors are doing, like this feels like the right thing to do. But increasingly, there's really interesting knowledge that's coming out that can inform the kind of decisions that you should be making or could be making, and providing you with the frameworks that you need in order to kind of structure your thinking. Another high-level thing is too much onus, in my opinion, is placed on the individual. So, we're taught how to be better networkers, how to listen better. There's so many courses and books and so on in the sort of personal development or self-help space. I'm really interested in how we, as the designers of these experiences, can take on much more of the responsibility to create the conditions to give connecting the best chance of happening in the first place. So it's much less, back to my example of the guy who had this transformative experience at one of our events in Sydney. If it had been a typical event, a typical networking event, he would have had a horrible time. And he mentioned that from the get-go. But we created this experience where he could just be a human. He could be himself, and he could, connect very naturally and authentically. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of some of the high-level things, I think. And, out of my work, the final chapter, both literally and metaphorically, of my work is a set of design prompts. So there are 19 design prompts that can support the design of more effective experiences of these contexts in which human connectivity has a much better chance of happening. And it looks at what are things specific to the individual, what are things specific to at what I describe as a social level. So when people are interacting in sort of this dyadic level, and then what are the contextual factors that you may have completely overlooked that could be supporting or hindering people's ability to make the connections they're looking for. There is a huge amount there. I can see it by the expression on your face that I've probably created as many questions as given answers, but there's a lot there to
I like it. And I know I was just thinking, when is he publishing the book? Because I want to read about that.
Really? Yeah. Which of the 3 books? that's the question. Yeah. So that's something that I'm actively in the process of kind of developing a concept for now. My work is very applied, and so that makes it very approachable, I guess, in its nature. And so therefore, I can take it, of course, within the academic realm, things remain fairly academic, and you have to, uphold certain conditions and so on in order to get a thesis published. But the translation of that into very practical things, and this is what I find when I'm working with organizations, there are so many aha moments, that you can just see behind people's eyes, the light bulbs coming on, and it's not rocket science that I'm talking about. It's really helping people to make sense of stuff they already know and giving them a structure and a framework to kind of ground their thinking in. So it's not complicated. And often when I'm, I speak at conferences, and, the people who come up to me afterwards and say, you've just helped me help it make sense, and it's that, and that's really gratifying. And so to be able to put that into a book form and get it out is great. And it's just juggling everything else that's going on. But maybe I should take some lessons from you as someone who's published as well.
Well, that's very kind, but it's fascinating when listening to you and having the both world of the practical world and the academic world and bringing them together. So, Peter, as I said earlier on, I'd love to listen to you many hours, but the format of the podcast doesn't allow it. But my last question for today is, with all the things that you've done, how do you see yourself in the next 3 years? What are your goals? What do you want to achieve in the next 3 years?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a great one to finish on. To be honest, my real goal is to get my work out of academia and into the hands of people to have positive impact. I think my real focus within my research was in organizational contexts, and there is a huge amount to be done there as we shift. I see the shift to much more people-centered organizations, where organizations are realizing the importance of creating spaces in which people can really thrive. And I think my work really plays into that. So to be honest, I'm still giving shape to what that might look like, what collaborations might look like. I see potential for a new role within organizations of a director of connectivity, or someone who can guide this process in a much more informed and sort of deliberate way, a more thoughtful way. And so talking to organizations at that level and thinking very strategically how to better design their organizations to fit this kind of people-centered future that we're getting into. On the same side, companies who are working on products and services in this space, if you're designing experiences and want to sort of up the human connectivity game, so it's really looking for opportunities to apply the research to have positive impact. And that positive impact is better connected people, which, as we know, leads to well-being, creativity, and productivity. So if there are listeners out there who have ideas, who have questions, I'm really open to collaborative opportunities, I guess is what I'm trying to say, where applying this kind of thinking, this knowledge, these frameworks in many different ways that can all lead to this improved sense of connectedness.
Thank you very much. And how do they get in touch with you?
The best is, you can find me on LinkedIn. I think my name is fairly unique, although there is another Peter Mandeno out there, or at petermandeno.com.
Wonderful. Peter, thank you so much. Truly enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to reading you in the future and hearing all the great outcomes of your work.
It's a pleasure, Eric. This was a fantastic way to spend a Wednesday afternoon. Thank you so much.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing all your insights. Fascinating Ph.D. And I see a lot of ways that could be implemented in the meetings and event industry. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to connect with me, please do so on LinkedIn or join my Facebook group, www.eventbusinessformula.com/group. And if you learned something or enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your network. Thank you. Bye-bye.